The wheels groaned against frozen earth as Thomas Whelan pulled his entire cabin across the Wyoming plateau, wolves circling in the darkness just beyond his lantern's reach. His mobile fortress, 8 feet by 12 feet of solid log construction, mounted on iron-reinforced wheels, had been rolling for 3 hours straight, the pack keeping pace, testing for weakness. Most men would be trapped in a stationary camp, feeding a fire and praying for dawn. But Thomas's invention was about to prove why a house that moved could mean the difference between survival and becoming prey on the frontier. Before we roll into this incredible story, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from, maybe from your own mobile home. And if tales of frontier innovation and survival fascinate you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we're sharing the story of the prospector who invented a drill that could punch through solid granite in minutes. The wheels groaned against frozen earth as Thomas Whelan pulled his entire cabin across the Wyoming plateau. Behind him, yellow eyes reflected his lantern, light 6 wolves, maybe 7, keeping pace with his strange procession. The lead wolf, a massive gray male, tested the distance every few minutes, darting closer before retreating. Thomas adjusted his grip on the pull bar and checked the loaded rifle mounted within arm's reach on the cabin's exterior frame. The wolves had been following for 3 hours. The mobile cabin rolled steadily forward, its iron-reinforced wheels crushing through patches of ice. Each wheel stood 4 feet in diameter, wider than wagon wheels, with metal strips bolted around the circumference for traction. The cabin itself, 8 feet by 12 feet of solid log construction, sat on a reinforced platform between the axles. Most men, seeing it for the first time, laughed or shook their heads in disbelief. A house that moved seemed to violate natural law, but on this December night in 1845, with predators stalking through darkness and the nearest settlement 40 miles away, Thomas's rolling fortress was about to prove its worth. The wolf pack grew bolder as clouds covered the moon. They spread into hunting formation, flanking the slow-moving structure. Thomas had seen this behavior before. They were testing for weakness, looking for the moment to strike. With a traditional camp, he would be trapped, building up his fire and hoping it lasted until dawn. But the mobile cabin offered options no stationary shelter could provide. Thomas reached the edge of a narrow canyon he had scouted weeks earlier. The passage was barely wide enough for his cabin, with rock walls rising 20 feet on either side. He maneuvered the structure into the canyon entrance and set the wheel brakes. Now the wolves could only approach from front or rear. He climbed onto the cabin's platform and opened the reinforced door, disappearing inside for 30 seconds. When he emerged, he carried his second rifle and a bullseye lantern that threw focused light 60 feet into the darkness. The wolves massed at the canyon mouth, agitated by the change in terrain. The alpha male paced back and forth, unwilling to enter the narrow space where his pack's numerical advantage disappeared. Thomas stood on his cabin's front platform, both rifles ready, watching the predators calculate their options. In a fixed camp, he would be the one trapped. Here, the geography worked for him. The mobile cabin had become a tactical advantage, allowing him to choose defensive positions no traditional traveler could reach. After 20 minutes of standoff, the pack retreated into open country. Thomas waited another hour before releasing the brakes and rolling deeper into the canyon, where he would shelter until dawn. The incident was one of dozens that winter where his mobile cabin's ability to relocate saved his life. Each survival story spread through trading posts and winter camps, slowly changing how frontier travelers thought about safety and shelter. By spring, Thomas Whelan's impossible invention had earned its first reluctant admirers. The idea for a house that moved was born from grief, not genius. 3 winters before that night with the wolves, Thomas Whelan had been a different man with a different life. He had trapped beaver along the Green River with moderate success, built standard cabins like every other mountain man, and traveled the same dangerous routes between trading posts. Most importantly, he had traveled with his wife Sarah, one of the few women brave enough to embrace the mountain life. Sarah Middleton had married Thomas in Independence, Missouri, in 1841. She was 22, daughter of a wheelwright, with strong hands and stronger opinions about frontier life. While other women headed for Oregon's promised farmland, Sarah chose the mountains. She could shoot, trap, and skin beaver as efficiently as any man. She understood the risks. What she couldn't understand was why frontier travel had to be so primitive when her father's shop built carriages that rolled smooth as silk on eastern roads. The winter of 1843 began harsh and grew worse. Thomas and Sarah had established their seasonal camp 30 miles north of Fort Bridger, planning to trap until spring. But December brought blizzards that buried their usual trails. Food ran low. They needed to reach the fort for supplies, but that meant 3 days of travel through weather that could kill within hours. They packed what they could carry, cached the rest, and started walking. Traditional winter travel meant moving between shelters, caves, groves of trees, abandoned camps if lucky. Travelers carried minimal gear because every pound mattered when breaking trail through snow. Canvas tents provided little protection against Wyoming winters. Most mountain men accepted these conditions as unchangeable. Move fast, find natural shelter, survive or die. Those were the only options anyone had ever known. On the second night, they couldn't find shelter. The storm had obscured landmarks, and they wandered for hours in whiteout conditions. Finally, exhausted, they dug a snow cave and huddled together with their single blanket. Thomas stayed awake, keeping Sarah close, sharing body heat. But hypothermia works slowly and surely. By dawn, when the storm finally broke, Sarah wouldn't wake up. She had died sometime in the last hours of darkness, while Thomas dozed despite his efforts to stay alert. Thomas carried her body the last 15 miles to Fort Bridger. Men at the fort helped him bury her in the makeshift cemetery where dozens of other frontier casualties lay. Standing at her grave, hands still numb from frostbite, Thomas made a promise that sounded like madness. He swore he would find a way to travel these mountains without leaving safety behind. Home itself would move. Shelter would follow wherever he went. No one would die from exposure while walking past materials that could have saved them. The men at Fort Bridger thought grief had broken his mind when Thomas started sketching designs that winter. A cabin on wheels? Impossible. The weight alone would be crushing. The terrain would destroy any axle built. But Thomas kept drawing, kept calculating, kept remembering Sarah's frozen face and the shelter they couldn't carry. Obsession replaced grief as the winter months passed. By spring, he had begun to build. Word spread through Fort Bridger like wildfire in dry grass. Thomas Whelan, the trapper who'd lost his wife to winter, had gone mad with grief. He was building a cabin on wheels. Men gathered outside the stockade walls to watch him work, trading jokes and shaking their heads. Some felt pity, others found entertainment in his delusion. But Thomas worked on, deaf to their laughter, measuring and cutting with the focused intensity of a man who had nothing left to lose but his obsession. The first problem was weight. A standard cabin used 40 to 50 logs, each weighing hundreds of pounds. The structure alone would exceed 2 tons. No wheel system could support that weight while crossing rough terrain. Thomas spent weeks just calculating, using charcoal on birch bark to work out load distributions. He reduced the cabin size to 8 feet by 12 feet, the absolute minimum for survival shelter. He selected lighter pine logs instead of heavy oak. Every decision aimed to cut weight without sacrificing strength. Jim Bridger himself, the fort's namesake and legendary mountain man, visited Thomas's worksite in April 1843. Bridger had seen plenty of crazy schemes in his years on the frontier. He walked around the partially built platform, examining the oversized wheels Thomas had commissioned from a reluctant wheelwright. After 10 minutes of silent inspection, Bridger spoke only 5 words. "Wheels'll break at first creak." Then he left, and his judgment carried weight. If Jim Bridger said it wouldn't work, it wouldn't work. The wheelwright, a German immigrant named Otto Steinberg, had only agreed to build the wheels for triple his normal price. He constructed them to Thomas's specifications, but warned repeatedly they would collapse under the cabin's weight. 4 feet in diameter, 6 inches wide, reinforced with iron bands, they looked sturdy enough for a freight wagon. But a house? Steinberg collected his payment and told Thomas he was wasting good money on grief-born foolishness. Engineers from the Surveying Corps passed through Fort Bridger that spring, mapping potential rail routes. Thomas approached them with his sketches, hoping for technical advice. They laughed harder than the trappers. One engineer, a West Point graduate named Lieutenant Collins, spent an hour explaining why the concept violated basic engineering principles. The lateral stress on the axles during turning would snap them. The weight distribution would create constant, instability. The pulling force required exceeded what any man could generate. Collins left convinced he had witnessed the saddest delusion he'd encounter in his career. But Thomas had advantages his critics overlooked. His late wife's father had been a wheelwright, and Sarah had grown up understanding carriages and wagons. During their courtship, she had explained technical details Thomas now recalled with painful clarity. He remembered her sketching how weight transferred through axle to wheel, how proper bearing placement reduced friction, how camber angles affected stability. Her knowledge, preserved in his memory, guided his construction. By September 1843, Thomas had assembled his mobile cabin alone. No one would help, considering it bad luck to encourage madness. The structure sat on its wheels outside Fort Bridger like a monument to impossible dreams. The laughter had mostly stopped by then. Mockery had turned to uncomfortable silence. Winter was coming, and everyone expected Thomas Whelan's folly to collapse with the first snow, probably taking him with it. The engineering challenges that Lieutenant Collins had declared insurmountable became Thomas's daily education. Each problem taught him something new about forces, materials, and the delicate balance between strength and weight. The first major breakthrough came when Thomas abandoned traditional wagon design entirely. Wagons carried load above their axles. Thomas realized his cabin needed to sit between the wheels, lowering the center of gravity until the structure was barely 18 inches off the ground. The axle system required complete reimagining. Standard wagon axles were straight iron bars, fine for normal loads, but inadequate for a house. Thomas created what he called a double axle configuration, 2 parallel axles, front and rear, connected by iron brackets that distributed weight across 8 bearing points instead of 4. He spent his savings on specially forged components from Fort Bridger's blacksmith, who took the job only because Thomas paid in advance with beaver pelts worth $200. The wheel problem proved equally complex. Otto Steinberg's wheels, while sturdy, needed modification. Thomas added a second iron band around each wheel's circumference, creating a tire surface 3 inches wide. Between the bands, he packed a mixture of pine tar and horsehair that would compress under load but provide cushioning over rough terrain. The wheels looked strange, almost primitive, but they could absorb impacts that would shatter conventional wagon wheels. Steering mechanisms on wagons relied on pivoting front axles. That wouldn't work with Thomas's weight distribution. Instead, he developed what modern engineers would recognize as differential pulling. 2 pull bars extended from the front axle, allowing him to apply force to either side independently. By pulling harder on the left bar while easing right, the cabin would turn gradually. The system required more effort than traditional steering, but gave precise control over direction. The most innovative element was Thomas's approach to pulling force. Lieutenant Collins had correctly calculated that no single man could pull a 2-ton cabin using conventional methods. Thomas didn't dispute the math. Instead, he changed the equation. He created a pulley system inspired by ship rigging, with mechanical advantage that multiplied his pulling force by 4. Heavy rope ran through blocks mounted on the cabin's frame, allowing him to move the structure by walking alongside rather than pulling from the front. Interior design focused on weight distribution and utility. Thomas built furniture directly into the walls, fold-down sleeping platform, integrated storage boxes, mounted rifle racks. Everything served double duty as structure and function. The small wood stove, essential for winter survival, sat at the cabin's exact center, its weight balanced perfectly. Even the door, reinforced with diagonal iron strapping, was positioned to maintain equilibrium when open or closed. Testing began in October 1843. Thomas's first attempt to move the cabin traveled exactly 12 feet before the front left wheel sank into soft ground. Critics at Fort Bridger felt vindicated. But Thomas studied the failure, reinforced the wheel attachment point, and tried again. The second attempt covered 50 yards. By November, he could move the cabin a quarter mile without stopping, learning how different surfaces required different techniques. Rock demanded slow, steady force. Sand required momentum. Mud was the enemy, always. By the time winter arrived, Thomas Whelan had created something unprecedented, a mobile shelter that one man could move across varied terrain. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't fast. On good ground, he might cover 2 miles per hour. But it was possible, and in the mathematics of frontier survival, possible was everything. The morning of November 3, 1843, Thomas Whelan began his first real journey. His destination was a beaver pond 15 miles north of Fort Bridger, a distance any trapper could walk in half a day. But Thomas wasn't walking. He was pulling his home, and those 15 miles would teach him lessons no amount of planning could have revealed. He set out at dawn with clear skies and frozen ground that seemed ideal for rolling. The first 3 miles went smoothly. The cabin rolled across hard-packed earth, wheels crushing through light frost. Thomas felt vindicated as Fort Bridger disappeared behind him. His pulley system worked as designed, multiplying his effort until the 2-ton structure moved at a steady walking pace. He had provisioned for a week, water barrels secured inside, food stored in wall-mounted boxes, firewood in a specially designed exterior rack. Everything seemed perfect. Then he reached Muddy Creek. The stream was only 8 feet wide and normally 18 inches. Deep, barely worth mentioning in summer. But November had brought rain, followed by freezing, creating a channel of half-frozen mud bordered by steep banks. Thomas studied the crossing for an hour, walking upstream and down, looking for better options. There were none. The mobile cabin would have to cross here or turn back. He positioned the cabin carefully, aligning the wheels with what looked like the firmest ground. The front wheels descended the bank successfully, crushing through ice into mud below. But as weight transferred forward, physics took control. The rear wheels, suddenly bearing more load, sank into the bank. The cabin tilted forward at an alarming angle. Inside, unsecured items crashed against the front wall. A water barrel broke free, spilling 20 gallons across the floor. Thomas released the pull bars and scrambled to the rear, trying to calculate solutions while water poured from his door. The cabin sat at a 30-degree angle, front wheels mired in creek mud, rear wheels buried in collapsing bank soil. If it tipped further, the structure would likely break apart. His mobile fortress had become an immobile disaster less than 4 miles from Fort Bridger. Working with desperate efficiency, Thomas unloaded everything movable from the cabin's front section, carrying supplies to solid ground. Each item removed shifted weight backward, slowly leveling the structure. He used his shovel to dig channels for water drainage, then packed rocks under the buried wheels. The work took 6 hours. By afternoon, he had the cabin sitting level but still stuck. Moving it seemed impossible. The solution came from remembering Sarah's father working on stuck carriages, leverage, and alternate angles. Thomas cut 2 young pines, trimming them into poles 15 feet long. He positioned them under the rear axle, creating massive levers. By alternating pressure on each pole, he could lift and shift the rear wheels inches at a time. Combined with careful pulling from various angles, the technique slowly extracted the cabin from its trap. By sunset, all 4 wheels stood on solid ground beyond the creek. But the crossing had revealed critical flaws. The rigid axle system that provided strength on flat ground became a liability on uneven terrain. The cabin couldn't flex to match surface changes. Thomas spent the night redesigning, sketching by firelight inside his tilted but intact shelter. By morning, he had a plan. The journey to the beaver pond would wait. First, his mobile cabin needed modifications that only failure could have taught him to make. James Morrison had been trading furs for 12 years when he encountered something that made him question his eyesight. It was May 18, 1844, and he was leading a pack train through South Pass, that gentle saddle in the Rocky Mountains where thousands would later cross on the Oregon Trail. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across sagebrush when Morrison spotted what appeared to be a cabin sitting in the middle of nowhere, 40 miles from the nearest settlement. Morrison reined in his horse and rubbed his eyes. Cabins didn't appear in empty valleys, but there it sat, solid logs and a chimney with smoke rising. Then he noticed the wheels. 4 massive wheels beneath the structure, and a man walking alongside with ropes over his shoulders. Morrison had heard rumors at Fort Bridger about Thomas Whelan's rolling house, but like everyone else, he'd assumed the stories were wildly exaggerated. Now he watched the impossible moving slowly across his field of vision. Thomas had been traveling for 6 months since his disaster at Muddy Creek. The modifications he'd made through winter had transformed the mobile cabin from an interesting failure into a functional system. The rigid axles were gone, replaced with a suspension design using leather straps and wooden springs that allowed each wheel to move independently. He'd added brake mechanisms to all 4 wheels, controllable from his walking position. Most importantly, he'd developed different wheel configurations for different terrain: wide wheels for soft ground, narrow for hard pack, even studded wheels for ice. Morrison spurred his horse and intercepted Thomas near a creek crossing. Up close, the mobile cabin was even more remarkable. Weather-tight construction, reinforced corners, gun ports cut into the walls. This wasn't some rickety experiment, it was a fortress that moved. Morrison dismounted and walked around the structure while Thomas rested, examining the engineering with a trader's eye for practical value. The questions came rapidly. How far could it travel daily? How did it handle storms? What about river crossings? Thomas answered with the patience of someone who'd explained his invention hundreds of times. 10 to 15 miles on good days, less in difficult terrain. Storms were actually easier than with traditional travel. He could position the cabin with its back to wind and wait inside. Rivers remained challenging, but he'd developed a float system using sealed barrels that could be attached for water crossings. Each answer came with specific examples, distances, dates. This wasn't theory. This was tested reality. The conversation lasted 2 hours. Morrison's pack train drivers gathered around, equally fascinated. One young driver named Carlos Mendoza had family on the Oregon Trail. He asked if such a cabin could make that journey. Thomas admitted he didn't know. He'd never tried distances beyond 100 miles. But the seed was planted. If a cabin could roll through South Pass, why not to Oregon? The mechanical principles were proven. Only endurance and determination limited the distance. Morrison departed with his mind churning. He reached Fort Laramie 8 days later and immediately wrote letters to business partners in Independence. The fur trade was declining, but the emigrant supply business was booming. Thousands of families headed west each. 8 year, many dying from exposure. What if they could purchase or rent mobile shelters? What if wagon trains included rolling cabins that provided secure shelter each night? The possibilities seemed endless, and Morrison had the trader's instinct for opportunity. Within 6 weeks, his letters had reached manufacturers in Street, Lewis, all describing the remarkable invention witnessed at South Pass. The storm descended from the northwest on December 12, 1844, a wall of white that swallowed the landscape. Thomas had been watching the sky all morning, reading signs in the cloud formations that promised the season's first serious blizzard. He was 20 miles from Fort Bridger, returning from a successful trapping expedition, when he realized he had perhaps 3 hours before conditions became lethal. In a fixed camp, he would already be gathering firewood and preparing for a multi-day siege. But the mobile cabin offered another option. 8 miles south lay Devil's Gate Canyon, a narrow passage with high walls that provided excellent wind protection. Thomas had sheltered there before in his mobile cabin, positioning the structure in a natural alcove where cliffs blocked weather from 3 sides. Making 8 miles in 3 hours while pulling 2 tons would be challenging on perfect ground. With wind rising and snow beginning to fall, it seemed impossible. But impossible had become Thomas's specialty. He adjusted his pulling harness and increased pace, using techniques learned through 18 months of mobile living. Short, powerful strides, constant rhythm. Let the pulley system multiply effort rather than fighting the weight directly. The first hour covered 3 miles as snow accumulated steadily. The wheels, fitted with studded winter configuration, bit through powder to find purchase on frozen earth below. Behind him, the cabin left deep tracks that filled with snow within minutes. 2 hours in, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Wind drove snow horizontally, reducing visibility to 20 feet. Thomas navigated by memory and instinct, following the barely visible line of a creek that led toward Devil's Gate. His beard and eyebrows accumulated ice. The pulling ropes grew stiff with freezing moisture. Twice he stopped to clear snow from the wheel mechanisms, precious minutes lost to maintenance that couldn't be delayed. The mobile cabin became a snow-covered boulder that he dragged through an increasingly hostile world. Then he heard voices. Faint shouts carried on the wind from somewhere ahead. Thomas altered course slightly, following the sounds. He found them huddled behind a small rise, a family of 5 with an ox-drawn wagon bogged down in a drift. The Hartley family, emigrants who had started late for Oregon and were now paying the price. Their oxen stood exhausted, unable to pull the wagon further. The father was trying to erect a canvas shelter while his wife wrapped their 3 children in every blanket they possessed. Thomas didn't waste time on introductions. He maneuvered his mobile cabin near their wagon and set the wheel brakes. The structure provided immediate windbreak. He opened his reinforced door and gestured the family inside. They stumbled into warmth. The small stove had been burning all day, keeping the interior at survivable temperature even while moving. The children, aged 4 to 10, were showing early signs of frostbite. The parents were near panic, knowing they had been minutes from disaster. Working together, Thomas and Mr. Hartley unhitched the oxen and led them into the lee of the mobile cabin. The animals would survive the night if kept out of direct wind. Meanwhile, Mrs. Hartley worked inside, using Thomas's supplies to make hot soup for everyone. The mobile cabin, designed for 1 person, held 6 in cramped but life-saving proximity. As the blizzard reached full fury outside, those inside were warm, fed, and secure. The Hartley family had expected to die that night. Instead, they found themselves in a rolling fortress that had appeared from the storm like something from a fairy tale. The Hartley family's survival story reached Fort Bridger 3 days after the blizzard cleared. They arrived on foot, having abandoned their wagon, but alive because of Thomas Whelan's mobile cabin. Mrs. Hartley told everyone who would listen about the miracle house on wheels that had saved her children. Within a week, the story had been retold 50 times, growing with each telling but maintaining its essential truth. The mobile cabin had turned certain death into mere discomfort. James Morrison arrived at Fort Bridger in January 1845 with 2 business partners from St. Louis. They had come specifically to see Thomas's invention, bringing with them an offer. Morrison's trading company wanted to build mobile cabins for rental to emigrant families. They proposed purchasing Thomas's design for $500 plus a percentage of rental fees. It was more money than most trappers saw in 5 years. Thomas refused. He would teach others to build their own, but the design belonged to everyone who needed it. Instead, Thomas spent that winter conducting what amounted to the frontier's first technical workshops. He demonstrated construction techniques to wheelwrights, blacksmiths, and carpenters who had traveled to Fort Bridger specifically to learn. Otto Steinberg, the wheelwright who had mocked the original concept, became Thomas's most devoted student. He developed improvements to the wheel design that reduced weight while maintaining strength. By spring 1845, Steinberg was building wheel sets specifically for mobile cabins. The first commercial versions appeared in March. A carpenter named Joseph Walsh built 3 mobile cabins using Thomas's principles, but adapted for families. These were larger 10 feet by 14 feet and required 2 people to move efficiently. Walsh added features Thomas hadn't considered: windows on multiple walls for cross-ventilation, exterior storage boxes for tools, even a small covered porch area that folded against the wall during travel. The rental price was $20 per month, steep but worthwhile for families who understood the survival value. Government interest followed commercial success. Captain Benjamin Bonneville, leading a surveying expedition for potential fort locations, encountered one of Walsh's mobile cabins in use by the Patterson family near Independence Rock. Bonneville immediately grasped military applications. Scouts could operate from secure, mobile bases. Survey teams could work in remote areas without establishing multiple camps. Supply lines could include mobile shelters for guards and personnel. His report to Washington described wheeled fortifications of remarkable utility. Trading posts along the Oregon Trail began stocking specialized hardware for mobile cabin construction. Iron brackets, reinforced wheels, pulley systems, and specialized axle designs became standard inventory. A cottage industry emerged around the concept. Some entrepreneurs offered conversion services, transforming standard wagons into hybrid shelter vehicles. Others sold plans and hardware kits for do-it-yourself builders. The Whelan system, as it became known, was entering mass adoption. By summer 1845, Thomas encountered mobile cabins he hadn't built, operated by people he'd never met. Near Fort Laramie, he passed the Zimmerman family in their modified version featuring a shingled roof instead of his sealed plank design. At Chimney Rock, he found a trading post constructed entirely from 3 connected mobile cabins, creating a movable business that followed customer traffic. His invention had evolved beyond his original vision, adapted and improved by dozens of creative minds solving their own specific problems. The mobile cabin concept attracted inventors and tinkerers like Honey-Drew Bears. By 1846, the basic Whelan system had spawned dozens of variations, each solving different problems for different people. In Independence, Missouri, a former railroad engineer named Marcus Crowley developed what he called the articulated cabin, two smaller units connected by a flexible coupling that could navigate turns impossible for single rigid structures. His design allowed families to separate living and storage spaces while maintaining mobility. The California Gold Rush of 1849 transformed mobile cabins from curiosity to necessity. Thousands of prospectors needed portable shelter that could move between claims. A craftsman named Lu Chen, who had emigrated from Canton, created collapsible mobile cabins using principles from Chinese architecture. His designs could be disassembled into flat panels for ship transport, then rebuilt on wheeled platforms at mining sites. Within months, Chen-style mobile structures dotted the Sierra Nevada foothills. Railroad construction crews discovered that mobile cabins solved their unique challenges. As tracks pushed westward, workers needed housing that could follow the railhead. The Union Pacific commissioned 50 mobile bunkhouses based on Whelan principles but scaled for industrial use. These structures, 20 feet by 40 feet, required teams of oxen to move, but provided secure housing for 20 men. They could be repositioned every few days as construction progressed, eliminating the need to build and abandon temporary camps. Military applications evolved rapidly. The Army Corps of Engineers developed armored versions with reinforced walls and gun ports for frontier fort construction. These mobile blockhouses could be deployed quickly to establish defensive positions, then relocated as strategic needs changed. During conflicts with various native tribes, mobile cabins provided secure command posts that couldn't be surrounded or besieged in traditional ways. The mobility itself became a defensive advantage. Perhaps the most ambitious evolution came from a group of Mormon settlers heading for Utah Territory. They created what they called rolling villages, collections of 10 to 15 mobile cabins that traveled together, forming instant communities wherever they stopped. Each cabin specialized in different functions: kitchen units with large stoves, medical cabins with surgical equipment, workshop cabins with tools and forges. When circled for defense or weather protection, these mobile villages provided all the amenities of permanent settlements. The technical innovations kept accumulating. Springs made from laminated wood improved ride quality. Steering mechanisms using ship-style wheels gave precise control. Brake systems using leather pads against iron wheels allowed safe descents on steep grades. Water collection systems captured rain while moving. Solar chimneys improved ventilation. Each improvement came from practical experience, from someone solving a specific problem they had encountered. By 1850, what had started as one grieving man's obsession had become an entire industry. Factories in St. Louis and Cincinnati mass-produced components. Technical schools taught mobile architecture as a legitimate construction discipline. Patents filed for various improvements numbered in the hundreds. The Whelan system had evolved far beyond Thomas's original vision, but the core principle remained. Home was no longer a fixed point, but a movable sanctuary that provided security wherever life led. Thomas Whelan settled in California's Sacramento Valley in 1851, purchasing 40 acres with gold he'd found while passing through the Sierra Nevada. He built his final home the traditional way, a fixed structure of adobe and timber that would never move again. Neighbors who visited found the irony amusing, the inventor of mobile living choosing permanent roots. But Thomas understood something his visitors didn't. The freedom to move had given him the power to choose when to stop. The mobile cabin he'd lived in for 8 years sat beside his adobe house, wheels removed, converted into a workshop where he repaired tools and tinkered with new ideas. Sometimes he would sit inside, remembering nights when those log walls had stood between him and death. The buffalo hide still showed claw marks from a grisly encounter in '47. The floor bore stains from the Hartley family's boots, packed with snow that terrible December night. Every scar told a story of survival made possible by mobility. Letters arrived regularly from people who had built their own mobile cabins. A doctor in Oregon created a traveling medical clinic that brought care to isolated settlements. A teacher in Kansas designed a mobile schoolhouse that served 3 communities on a rotating schedule. A photographer in Colorado built a mobile darkroom that let him document the frontier as it was being settled. Each letter described adaptations Thomas had never imagined, problems solved in ways that improved on his original design. The 1850s saw mobile living evolve from frontier necessity to cultural phenomenon. Traveling merchants operated mobile stores stocked with goods for isolated communities. Circuit judges held court in mobile courthouses that brought law to places where permanent institutions hadn't reached. Religious ministers preached from mobile churches that served scattered congregations. The concept Thomas had created from grief had become infrastructure for civilizing the wilderness. Railroad companies, initially seen as competition for mobile cabins, became unexpected allies. Trains could transport mobile structures faster than they could roll themselves. Flat cars designed for mobile cabin transport let families ship their homes to railroad terminals, then continue overland from there. The combination of rail transport and mobile flexibility opened territories previously too remote for settlement. Towns sprang up where mobile communities had proven the land viable. By 1860, historians estimate over 5,000 mobile structures based on Whelan system principles operated across the American frontier. They ranged from single-person shelters to massive mobile warehouses. The economic impact was substantial. An entire industry of builders, suppliers, and operators had emerged. But the social impact was greater. Families had survived who would have perished. Communities had formed where isolation once reigned. The frontier had been tamed partly through mobility. Thomas Whelan died peacefully in March 1868, aged 59. His funeral drew hundreds, including many who had never met him but whose lives his invention had saved. Otto Steinberg spoke at the service, describing his transformation from skeptic to advocate. The Hartley children, now adults, attended with their own families. Marcus Crowley brought technical drawings for his latest innovation, a steam-powered mobile cabin that needed no human pulling power. The mobile cabin era peaked in the 1870s, then gradually declined as railroads reached everywhere and permanent towns replaced temporary settlements. But the philosophy Thomas Whelan had introduced, that home could be movement, that security could be portable, that survival meant adaptation, had permanently changed American culture. The covered wagons of the Oregon Trail gave way to prairie schooners, then to motorhomes and recreational vehicles. Each generation rediscovered the freedom of taking shelter with them. Today, archaeological surveys still find remnants of mobile cabins across the western states. Wheel ruts too wide for wagons mark routes where rolling homes passed. Foundation stones show where mobile structures rested, sometimes for years, before moving on. These traces map a different history of the frontier, not just of destinations reached, but of journeys survived. They remind us that sometimes the most profound inventions arise from the simplest questions. What if home could follow wherever we need to go? Thomas Whelan answered that question, and his answer saved lives while changing how Americans thought about the relationship between security and mobility. The impossible had become indispensable, one rolling mile at a time.